get to the tip of the iceberg. So let me just get my slides there. During the Second World War, 39 women were specially selected to work in a secretive, clandestine, and mainly male domain, Special Operations Executive French section, otherwise known as SOE F. Ranging from housewives and mothers to shop assistants and countesses, these women were put through a rigorous training program in which they learned silent killing, instinctive shooting and sabotage, as well as survival tactics to prepare them for life as a secret agent. Some went by parachute, others landed by boat or aircraft to begin their dangerous work in enemy-occupied France, where for most of them, work would involve being a wireless operator or a courier. Sorry, my screen's just going a little strange, so let me just hide a few things so that I can see what's going on here. That's better. The latter, the couriers, often travelled hundreds of kilometres carrying a vital yet incriminating information, whilst for the former, workers involved in assisting in receiving arms and vital supplies, undertaking huge risks to make contact with SOE headquarters over the radio waves. Behind enemy lines, they operated beyond the protection of the Geneva Convention, and at worst, they were given a life expectancy of just 6 weeks. The Nazi occupation of Europe and the resistance rising up against it showed the War Cabinet that they needed to use agents to fight from within. The fall of France came as a huge blow to the Allies and led to the forming of Special Operations Executive. The idea for this new organisation had been mooted in several memoranda throughout the spring and early summer of 1940, and on the 22nd of July, it was formally approved by the War Cabinet. The Prime Minister promptly gave the new head of SOE the much quoted directive, set Europe ablaze. Their objective was to coordinate and assist local clandestine activity against the Axis powers and their occupying forces in territories across Europe and beyond. As a result, SOE would liaise with, equip, train and arm the local resistance so that when the time came, they could pave the way for the invading forces of D-Day and fight back against the occupiers. SOE agents would also assist with sabotage and subversion on every level, from smaller acts of resistance, such as false intelligence and propaganda, to cutting power lines, derailing trains and blowing up factories. And they would do all of this in spite of the Nazi threat that any passive or active opposition to the German armed forces would incur the most severe of retaliatory measures. And so SOE set up a number of sections, mostly working in occupied Europe, hence the map I've got up here showing where the occupation was at by 1942. And SOE worked in various countries, including, but not restricted to, France, Holland, Belgium, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, and Albania. It also operated in the Far East in a branch known as Force 136. Now, the branches focusing on France would actually total 6 sections in all, and today I'm focusing on just one of those, which is SOE F section. In April of 1942, 2 years after its creation, and in accordance with its central tenet to go straight for the objective across any social or military conventions that may get in the way, SOE made the groundbreaking decision to employ women in the field as secret agents. This was an unprecedented move. Up until this point, women had contributed to the war effort in a wide variety of ways, highlighted by these posters. From working in munitions factories and as drivers to clerical work and nursing. They usually worked on the home front, occasionally abroad, and only a very few had recently engaged in combat behind enemy lines. Indeed, the value and usefulness of women agents had just been proved to the organisation through the exploits of these 2 ladies, the American Virginia Hall and the Polish lady, Krystyna Skarbek, you may also know as Christine Granville. Using women was sensible, according to Selwyn Jepson, who was the SOE recruiting officer. In his view, women were very much better than men for the work. Women, as you must know, he said, have a greater capacity for cool and lonely courage than men. Men don't work alone. Their lives tend to always be in company with other men. Now, on a more practical level, moreover, once in France, the women were less likely to attract attention because they could continue their day-to-day duties, including cycling, which was important for courier work, using covers such as working as district nurses, medical or cosmetic representatives. Whereas from the summer of 1942, men of working or military age had been forced by the Nazis to undertake compulsory labour in the Service du Travail Obligatoire, known as the STO. Now, the French army had pretty much been disbanded after the occupation of France, and men were no longer permitted to serve in the French armed forces. And so many of them were forced into this labour programme to go into occupied territory and to produce armaments and so on. Those who refused, who did not want to do this, formed something called the maquis, and the maquis literally translates as scrub or brush, the area of land where these men moved into. They were resistance who lived in the hillsides and in the forests, and who began to pave the way for D-Day, and whom SOE became involved with. So who are these women? Well, the right women were in a far more advantageous position to carry out clandestine activities undercover. And the paths that these women took to SOE were as diverse as they were themselves. In its formative months, back in the summer of 1940, SOE was something of an old boys network. Word of mouth recruitment was encouraged, and male friends and colleagues from schools, universities, regiments, and businesses sought each other out to work together. But in the 1940s, there was no female equivalent, and neither, therefore, was there any prescribed method for recruiting female agents. Partly as a result of which, SOE recruited an extraordinary range of women, from the ranks of the aristocracy to those of working class backgrounds, and of all ages. The youngest, Sonia Butt, also known as Sonia d'Artois, was only 19 years old, whilst the oldest, Marie-Thérèse Lechaine, was 51. Although no particular experience of the war was required, perhaps the most apposite recruits for SOE were women who had fled from France, either at the outset or in the early days of the war, and so they had some experience of living in occupied France, perhaps even working with the resistance. 4 of the female agents recruited into F section, André Borel, Vera Lee, Madeleine Damamont, and Nancy Wake, had previously worked on escape lines. This was a form of resistance which helped downed British airmen, escaped POWs or stranded servicemen to find their way out of occupied territory and back to safety. In fact, Ashley and I have just been talking about this, and this here is a map of the occupied zones and the escape routes out of them. It usually meant a journey across the mountains to Spain, then traveling to Gibraltar or Portugal, finally making their way back to Britain. And so these women would have an excellent knowledge of France and of the mountains, and an excellent understanding of the occupation and good language skills, which were of course a very strong asset to SOE. Now, several of the women were mothers or housewives who found themselves called to interview through various ruses, as in the case of Marguerite Peggy Knight, who was overheard speaking French at a party, while Yvonne Roudelard was approached through contacts at the Ibrid Court Club in London, where she worked. A few of the women, including Lise de Bézac, Eliane Plumen, and Francine Agazarian, already had spouses or siblings in SOE who put them forward as viable candidates to be considered by the organisation. Another route that the women might come in through was the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or the WAF. They were instructed to look out for exceptional women who might be useful to SOE. And indeed, it identified a number of women who went on to become SOE agents, some of whom I'm going to discuss a little later on. SOE was also able to gain valuable information that was provided on the many forms that civilians had to fill out for a plethora of reasons. They could be applications for identity cards, to join the services, or even to get permission to fly abroad. And they would provide a wealth of details that could show whether a person had the right qualities to warrant an SOE interview. British Customs also agreed to inform SOE should anyone suitable pass through their offices, in addition to which suitable candidates who were spotted at the London Reception Centre in Wandsworth, southwest London, where MI5 interrogated all foreign nationals who had reached Britain from enemy-occupied territory, might also have their details passed on to SOE, and their headquarters was here at the Royal Patriotic School. Now, age and social background were not determining factors in SOE's recruitment. It was more about the candidates' experience, their motives, and their personality, which were considered to be extremely important. According to the SOE advisor, the first qualification for an F section candidate was that they had to be able to pass as a native of the place they were in. So they had to speak and know French as a native would. They obviously had to look French, and as if they would be able to have all the other necessary qualities for it. By that, he meant this ability to blend in, this ability to work alongside the French as if you'd always been there and not just dropped in by parachute the night before. And so they needed this knowledge of France and the French way of life, as well as this ability to blend in. Selwyn Jepson, who I mentioned was the recruiting officer, said they should have enough physical courage and sufficient intelligence, combined with just enough leadership to enable them to carry out one simple and specific job. Above all, the women had to have a willingness to entertain the possibility of working for SOE and therefore to take on clandestine and dangerous work. The reasons for such willingness, the reasons for these motives vary greatly. The women were attracted to resistance work for many different reasons: to fight the regime, to protect the future of their families, or to avenge a loved one's death or deportation. Yolanda Beekman's motives for joining SOE were, we have been informed, idealism. I say informed, this comes from her personnel file. Idealism, the good of the cause, and devotion to duty. Pearl Witherington, who I had the fortune to meet and interview, had served with the office of the British Air Attaché in Paris since 1933 and escaped to London after the occupation, arriving in July 1941. She wanted more than anything to find a way to get back into France and to fight back against the occupiers, which SOE offered her. Nancy Wake had already worked with the resistance, and she too wanted to go back. F Section heard of her work and admired her courage, and so they brought her in for interview. And Phyllis Latour, who is the only F Section agent, or female agent, I should say, who is still alive at the grand old age of 100, was the daughter of a French doctor. She wanted the opportunity to make her mark against the Germans in revenge for their shooting of her godmother's father, whom she had looked on as her own grandfather, and her godmother's suicide after being imprisoned by the enemy. Selwyn Jepson recognized that the agents he recruited had many different motives, and it was his job to establish during the interview what that woman's motive was, and if as a result of that, she was suitable for recruitment into SOE. The initial interview was generally conducted in central London at the former Hotel Victoria in Northumberland Avenue or at Horse Guards. If successful, subsequent interviews might be held at Orchard Court, which is just off Baker Street. There, F Section had use of an impressive apartment, complete with a black marble bathroom. For some women, arriving at this interview was the first time that they'd even contemplated war work, while for other, more experienced hands, it would signal a welcome return to resistance activities. For some recruits, it was a break from the monotony of a desk job in the WAF or other services, and for several, it meant leaving behind their children in an attempt to secure their safety and the hope of a brighter future. Jepson used the interviews to glean information. He had a way of interviewing where he didn't give away what the job was, but he was able to ascertain whether these were the right people. And it was only once he had established that he then told them the details of the nature of the work, of what the work involved, including the dangers and the chances of survival, which were estimated at the height of the war as being 50-50. He then waited for a candidate's reaction. He was wary of initial bursts of enthusiasm, which could indicate a misconceived notion about the war. And of course, he was wary of those who showed fear or an inability to maybe blend in and to undertake the job that was needed. So once the women were recruited, they would either maintain their WAF uniform, or they would be enlisted in this organisation, the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, or the Fanny, which was vital to the success of SOE, both as a cover and a source of personnel. Fanny was originally set up in 1907, and in the Second World War, it was divided into two. One part became the Women's Transport Service, the WTS Fanny, which provided drivers to the RAF and the Army. And the other part was an autonomous Fanny headquarters, which continued to run in London. And it was this organisation that worked alongside SOE. Not only did Fanny provide cover for the agents, it also paired the agents with wireless operators who would get to know their fist, which was the uniquely recognisable way that they tapped Morse code while sending. And so they would be able to work out if an agent was dealing with something incorrectly, if something had been sent wrongly, or if indeed the agents were transmitting under duress. I must point out one of the really important parts of being in this uniform was during the training. You can't really tell your parents or your husband that you're off for a few months training to be a secret agent, but while wearing this uniform, they then had a cover for their training to work undercover. So this uniform not only helped provide a salary, but also a means of waiting, or a means of cover while training. Sorry, I'm trying to let people in and speak at the same time. Training was intended to last between 6 to 9 months, ideally. However, if an agent was desperately needed in the field or proved unusually competent, then the training period could be cut short to reflect their talents, or indeed it could be lengthened due to the limitations of the agent in question. The potential agents would learn how to use various weapons and explosives. They would learn close combat, silent killing, how to recognize various uniforms, how to survive in occupied territory, parachuting, wireless training, and undertake a series of exercises and schemes designed to test their strength and abilities. The courses would test them to their limits, physically, mentally, and psychologically. They were held at special training schools known as the STS, many of which were requisitioned stately homes, giving rise to the joke, in particular by the head of MI6, that SOE really stood for the stately homes of England. The first course that the agents would undertake was the preliminary training course. These were held either at Wanborough Manor, STS 5, which is just outside Guildford in Surrey, or later in the war at STS 7, Winterfold Manor. Here, the agents were known strictly by code names, and the 2-week course was, I quote, conducted under commando cover. That is, inquisitive locals were told that commando training was going on, and potential agents sometimes believed that themselves. The training included physical training, weapons handling, unarmed combat, elementary demolitions, map reading, fieldcraft, and basic signalling. Now, it's all very well to say that these were held under commando cover. That's great if you're a bloke in uniform who's just come from the army. But as far as I'm aware, women didn't join the commandos. And so it was really a baptism of fire for the women who turned up for this training course. One agent, Odette W, who I'll discuss later, turned to her friend Pearl Witherington and said, "What is it we're training for? Thought I was going to be a bilingual secretary." So can you imagine the shock when suddenly she's shooting at moving targets and blowing things up and being timed on assault courses, when she really thought that she'd just come to do some bilingual typing. Now, if they passed this course, that was all well and good. They would be sent to the next training course up in Scotland. But those who failed would also be sent to Scotland to a place called the Cooler at Inverleigh in Inverness-shire. It's like a garden leave, if you like, for failed secret agents. Once you've been taught instinctive shooting and how to pick locks, you're not the kind of person who should be allowed back into normal society. And so it was a way of letting these skills diffuse a little. Many of them made uniforms or did war work whilst up at the Cooler. And that will be a subject one day of a further study. Now, the paramilitary course was held at Arisaig in Scotland at a selection of shooting lodges. And the idea of this course was how to teach the students to deal with the tougher side of life as an agent. It was held on the rugged west coast of Scotland. And the course lasted between 3 to 5 weeks, testing a recruit to their limits. It included physical training, silent killing, unarmed combat, and a way of living off the land. Demolitions and explosives training was also essential, as sabotage was a huge part of SOE's remit right the way across Europe. Using dummy explosives, rail sabotage was carried out with the cooperation of the West Highland Line, who also supplied the school with a train. So basically they could practice blowing up the train lines. Students were taught how to lay dummy charges and fog signals and then hide, unlike many films will show you where they sit and wait for the explosive. Now, to highlight some objects from the museum's collection, these are a selection of knives that some of the agents would have trained with. Of particular interest to me is the one in the middle of the left-hand slide, the Fairbairn Sykes knife there that's got the kind of curved blade. That's fascinated me ever since the first day I saw it. And then on the other side, we also have a series of weapons that the agents would have trained with, these belonging to a personal collection held within the museum, belonging to the Masons. The sheaths, going back to the other side of the picture there, there's a prototype sheath, I should say, to be used on the arm. They did say a Fairbairn Sykes dagger could be used and hidden on the leg. I've tried it, it doesn't work very well anyway. But the Fairbairn Sykes dagger is something that the agents would be taught with. So Fairbairn and Sykes were two Shanghai policemen. They'd worked out in Shanghai during the 1930s, dealing with the underworld of drug barons and gangs. And they had developed this combat, this silent killing and unarmed combat, which was then immensely useful to SOE itself. So the bottom slide here shows you a close-up of a normal Fairbairn Sykes, a straight bladed one. There's the image above that shows you the cross section of the way that the weapon is used. And the daggers, again, from the museum are on the bottom left. And the one in the middle is something called a sleeve dagger. This could be concealed up inside the sleeve of a jacket or a jumper, and is a triform blade, which can be used to certainly slow somebody down. At the top there, I've also included the Sten gun, the iconic resistance weapon. And of course, there's a whole talk in how good or how bad the Sten gun actually is. So if I can use this as an advert for you to get into the museum and to see these wonderful, wonderful weapons, please do take your opportunity to do so, because they really are worth seeing. So the Fairbairn and Sykes dagger was issued, agents were taught how to use it, but they didn't necessarily take it into the field like all of these weapons, because they instantly give you away if you're caught with them. Far better to learn to use your bare hands. And there are whole manuals teaching agents how to use their knees, their hands, their elbows to disarm and to slow down a member of the German army or the Gestapo. In fact, if I can refer you to a program on BBC Alba at the moment, all about the Arisaig schools, there's some really good representations and reconstructions of just what the training was like. Parachuting. Personally, I can't think of anything worse, but if you wanted to go into enemy occupied territory, you had to get there somehow. And one of the ways was to go in by parachute. And the training was held at Ringway Aerodrome, which is now Manchester International Airport. It was here that students did at least 2 jumps, but mostly, more usually, they would jump from an aircraft and static balloons. However, you do see an image in the middle of the apparatus that would teach them how to jump safely. When being infiltrated into the field, they may have to jump from altitudes as low as 300 and 400 feet, meaning only 10 to 15 seconds in the air. And so the training was nerve-wracking. Yvonne Based told me it was completely unnatural, but you sort of got used to it. There were, of course, injuries. There were broken legs, Lisa Bazak, twisted ankles, Violette Szabo, and even a smashed face or two. However, having a prosthetic limb did not necessarily stop you from parachute jumping. I showed you an image earlier of Virginia Hall, who actually had a false leg, went by the name of Cuthbert. That therein is another story. Now, she never parachuted in, but Andrei Koversky, who actually happened to be the lover of the other agent on that picture, Krystyna Skarbek, did have a prosthetic limb, and he trained to be a parachute instructor. And so it really was down to the person whether they were able or not to parachute. Some claimed a fear of heights and were dropped in by Lysander or even went in by felucca. This picture always amuses me. This is a picture of an agent called Jacqueline Nairn, a phenomenal agent who features in the film Now It Can Be Told. A lot of people put up this slide and say, here is an SOE wireless operator, a real one. It's a real SOE agent, but I must tell you that Jacqueline was a courier. She wasn't a wireless operator. Now, female agents in the main were employed in either of those two jobs, as a courier or as a wireless operator. Couriers required the ability to blend in and keep a low profile, as their job was to carry messages, reports, or any other material from place to place. Their normal mode of transport would be bicycle or train. Therefore, they ran the risk of encountering spot checks and roadblocks. They would help other agents find safe houses and act as lookouts for wireless operators. Couriers would rendezvous with other agents and were therefore at risk of being drawn into traps set by the Nazis or collaborators. Couriers were required to know as few people as possible, but in practice this was very difficult because they were out in public and always on the move. They would cycle considerable distances in one day and did whatever was required of them by the network leader. Sometimes this would involve deputizing for them, assisting with arms drops, and possibly even sabotage. Although this was not strictly the role of the courier, it was sometimes the case that everyone was required to help. Now, I don't have an image to help me here, but I've just mentioned networks. Imagine, if you will, that France is a huge patchwork quilt. It's been divided into networks or circuits by SOE. And each circuit has a leader, a wireless operator, and then several other people working within the circuit, a courier or two. And so each circuit will work with one another. They need to provide information to each other, and each circuit needs to know the status of the other, whether it's been blown, whether it's been infiltrated, and so on. And the wireless operator was critical to the successful working of the network. They would have to change locations as much as possible to avoid detection by one of these, which is a Nazi direction finding van, or a DF. These house mobile equipment, and there was an aerial on top which could hone in on an illegal wireless signal within 20 minutes. If that illegal wireless was being used using mains electricity, it was quite easy to find them because they would cut off the electricity block by block. When the signal was gone, they knew that they were in the right area and would begin door-to-door searches. So the maximum time for a live transmission, sending and receiving in code, was 20 minutes. Of course, this was a huge, huge problem. The messages could become garbled. I mean, they're going across the channel. They could have a disrupted signal caused by jamming or a noisy frequency. And they had to be sent using unique codes that originally the wireless operator was required to memorize. And there's a whole other talk in this. They use one-time pads, poem codes, and so on. And their work was fraught with danger. If they were caught, an entire network could fall apart because that operator was needed. They were a lifeline. They needed to ask for supplies, pass intelligence, or relay other important messages, such as arrest updates or requests for more agents. I would argue they had the most dangerous job of all agents, as they risked detection while transmitting or capture moving about the country using their wireless sets. They also knew details about other members of the network and its activities that others did not. Training a wireless operator was time-consuming, and they were difficult to replace due to their specialized skills. So those chosen for the wireless training course were sent away to perfect their skills away from the other agents to one of several locations across the Midlands, including Tame Park in Oxfordshire. and it would take place either before or after the Scottish courses. As an added note, Tame Park currently have an exhibition about their history, and apparently there is a section on their work as an SOE wireless school. Most of the agents had to start their wireless training from the very beginning. They started by learning Morse code and gradually worked their speed up to in excess of 22 words a minute, bearing in mind that the average speed of a GPO telegraphist was 12 words a minute. In training, agents were expected to practice until they were perfect and to be perfect every time. They also had to learn to incorporate predetermined security checks in their messages so that the listening posts in England could establish whether the messages were genuine, being sent under duress, or even being sent by the Germans. Now, I've already mentioned the Fanny and them listening in to pick up the wireless signals. And this is a very famous photograph. Remember, the enemy is listening. This is Grendon Underwood receiving station, which is, or was, and still is, a prison. But this was one of the places that SOE would receive those messages. Now, to help avoid detection, the wireless sets had to be as portable as possible and light enough to be carried by hand or on a bicycle without attracting attention. They conceived the idea of placing the wireless transmitter and receiver in an ordinary-looking continental suitcase. These were produced and aged by SOE's camouflage section, and the wireless sets were designed and made at Station 9, which was Frith House in Hertfordshire, the SOE's Research and Development Centre. And these are two wireless sets that are again housed within the Combined Services Military Museum. By August 1942, a suitable wireless set had been built that could actually operate from the mains and from dry batteries with a range of 400 miles, which was vast, but it weighed a ton. Okay, not literally, it weighed 42 pounds because it used obsolete bulky components. The wireless pictured here is a Type A Mark III SOE wireless suitcase and is a later version which weighed only 9 pounds or 4 kilos. Considered by many SOE operatives to be the best version built in the Second World War, it could be carried in a small suitcase. It also had a feature where with the throw of a single switch, the power could be changed from mains to battery. And this was ideal for thwarting those DF, the Gestapo searchers, as they switched off the power to buildings, as I've mentioned, to listen for transmittings they were monitoring to stop, thus narrowing their area. So these suitcase wirelesses were incredibly important. Now, once the SOE agents had finished their wireless training, they would be sent to Beaulieu in the New Forest. And it was here that all recruits, whether wireless operator or courier, received their final training. They were taught the elements of clandestine techniques and security. Above all, and this must be my favorite quote about SOE, above all, the importance of looking natural and ordinary whilst doing unnatural and extraordinary things. Beaulieu was the place where agents learned the reality of what it would be like to live in France and what being a secret agent really meant. In fact, it wasn't just F section that went to Beaulieu. All of the country sections had various houses dotted around the Beaulieu estate. It's known as the rings. So there would be Czechs, Poles, French, Belgians, all in these houses. They weren't supposed to mix, but I imagine that they did. Agents were taught about the importance of false documents, papers and cover stories, and learnt to recognize various military uniforms. They were taught various methods of contacting one another through the use of letterboxes, cutouts, or dead drops. Beaulieu was also the place where agents would become at one with their cover. They would learn in every tiny detail, every tiny bit of their character and their cover story, and they would be questioned from time to time on it. An element of training at Beaulieu, which helped prepare the agent for life in France and its possible consequences, was the infamous mock interrogation. An agent's progress at Beaulieu would be tested in schemes lasting between 48 to 72 hours. These tested the agent's ability in making contact with a cutout or an intermediate, talking to someone in a city, losing someone who was following them. Longer schemes including making contact with a supposed resistance member. Despite all the strains and rigors of the final stages of SOE training, Beaulieu was and remains a place of calm and tranquility. Many agents said it was a piece of England that made them remember what they were fighting for. Agents found time for contemplation in the grounds of the old abbey, and a monument, which is pictured here, is still there today to remember this as the SOE finishing school. So what now? Well, now it was down to the agents' reports, and these are held in the personnel files, which are at the National Archives in Kew. They provide a wealth of information about the trainees and also show us the attitudes of some of the instructors and staff. Some of the women received really damning reports. Yolanda Beekman, she was described as a nice girl, darned the men's socks, would make an excellent wife to an unimaginative man, but not much more than that. Can you imagine if a report was put out today like that? Nur Inayat Khan, a very famous wireless operator, was described, as you can see here, as not overburdened with brains, but has worked hard and shown keenness, apart from some dislike of the security side of the course. She has an unstable and temperamental personality, and it is very doubtful whether she's really suited for work in the field. But can I draw your attention to the pencil writing that's on this slide here? Nonsense is written. We don't want them overburdened with brains. And on the next page, it says absolute balls, makes me cross. These are written by a man called Maurice Buckmaster, the head of SOE F section. He did not agree with Colonel Spooner's report on Nur Inayat Khan, and in fact, he overruled this report and sent Nur into the field and eventually to her fate at Dachau concentration camp. Lisa Bazak, however, was given a glowing report. She was described as intelligent, extremely conscientious, reliable and sound in every way, quite imperturbable, would remain cool and collected in every situation, very much ahead of her fellow students. We certainly recommend her for employment in the field. So you can see how these reports are at odds with each other, how different they are, and yet all of these women were infiltrated. In fact, Lise went in twice. The second time, well, she got herself in a bit of hot water, actually. She worked for a man called Tony Brooks, and they just didn't see eye to eye. And both times she was in France, she ended up working alongside her brother, Claude de Bazac. In total, F section deployed 480 agents, 39 of whom were women. And it's the 39 women who have been the focus of my studies for many years now and are the focus of my story. I realize that I've already spoken for quite some time, but I would like to just give you some case studies of some of the women, and so you can understand them a little bit better. I hope that's okay. Ashley, send me a message if I'm talking too much. Now, this is Yvonne Based, and I was lucky enough to interview her. She was born in Paris on the 20th of January, so we've just missed her birthday, 1922. Gosh, we've just missed her 100th birthday, in fact. She was born to a French mother and English father who was a dispatch rider and then a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. Yvonne was educated in various European countries, including France, until the age of 14 when she arrived in England. When war broke out, her father permitted her to join the WAF, and she was commissioned on the 8th of December 1940, aged just 18. In early 1943, Yvonne was invited for interview in London with Selwyn Jepson. As soon as she arrived at the interview, Yvonne realised it was something to do with languages. She was bilingual and thrilled to think she could do something for the war effort other than being a WAF officer. All she was told was that she would be trained and would be working behind enemy lines if she was found suitable. Above all, it was top secret. She didn't know anything about it other than what she was told over the desk. In the summer of 1943, her training began. She found the wireless training difficult because she said they had to learn every technicality of a radio set, how to repair it if it went wrong. And part of being the radio operator, we had to learn coding and decoding. It's a bit of a nuisance, she said, especially the radio side of it, because you had to reach a certain speed and receive and send radio at that speed. Also, as I mentioned, she hated the parachute training. Eventually, Yvonne was sent into France. In fact, her first attempt at infiltration was aborted as a reception committee lights and the signals at the landing site were not considered correct by the pilot and dispatcher. She returned to England and successfully parachuted into France on the night of the 17th, 18th of March, 1944. She made her way across France near Dole, where she was to be wireless operator to the Scholar network, which is highlighted on the image, and circuit leader, or the circuit leader of which was Hilaire. And she became a lifeline back to England, sending and receiving vital messages. She had 3 radios scattered around, one in the place where she was staying and the other 2 were at different addresses. She was constantly on the move. Transmission times were brief because of the possibility of interception by German direction finding vans, which were everywhere. Now, she was involved in the parachute reception, and the most important one was, I believed until recently, Operation Cadillac. I've since found that the dates don't actually match with this, but the daylight drop she was involved in was the first daylight drop of the war, happening just after D-Day on the 25th of June, 1944. I need to find the name. In broad daylight, 440 parachutes of essential supplies, arms and equipment were dropped from 32 B-15 flying fortresses over the Jura region of France. Amongst those on the ground was Yvonne. Her code name, incidentally, was Odette, not to be confused with several other Odettes. It was amazing, she said, the middle of a Sunday morning. It was extraordinary. A lovely sunny day, seeing all these parachutes dropping and knowing this was all the equipment coming in successfully behind D-Day. Yvonne was instrumental in this, waiting for 48 hours to receive the goods and then distributing them to resistance groups and partisans across the region. However, it was following this drop that her network was compromised and the Nazis carried out a raid on their depot. Yvonne and her fellow agents were eventually captured. It was due to a misunderstanding. Her colleague and circuit leader Lucien was injured. He then took his SOE issue suicide pill and died. Immediately after her arrest on the 26th of June 1944, Yvonne was taken to local Gestapo headquarters for interrogation. During questioning, she stuck to her cover story, which the Germans did not believe, and so she was taken from the interrogation room to the basement of the Gestapo headquarters building, where she was left without food and water for 3 days. From Gestapo headquarters, she was sent to Dijon jail, where she remained for 2 weeks, and then she was transferred to Saarbrück concentration camp, and from there to Ravensbrück concentration camp just north of Berlin, where she was given the number 62,947. I was in block 26, she told me. We were in 3-tier bunks, and because there were so many of us, we were 2 head to toe. It was very basic. You wanted to keep what you had on you, otherwise someone else would take it, and there was nothing else. We had sort of triangles. We all had practically red triangles, which meant political prisoner. We all did what we could to help one another. I remember the feeding was brought in huge buckets, well, bigger than buckets, which was really soup and perhaps bread. And twice a day we had some form of ersatz, or false coffee. That's roughly what we got every day. Every day we had a parade. In other words, we were all trooped out and had to stand in rows. We just stood around every morning from 6 to 8. A couple of hours, I suppose. Then they checked the numbers to see that we were all there. Yvonne suffered quite terribly at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She developed tuberculosis, and she also had a very near miss while working on the railway siding, where the looted goods from Jewish prisoners were brought from all over Europe. So trainloads of goods would arrive, including pillows. And one day Yvonne said she was unloading some pillows. One of them kind of exploded. The feathers went everywhere. One of them landed on a guard's uniform, and he got the butt of his rifle and made to hit her in the face with it. She just about avoided it because she almost certainly would have been killed. Yvonne Based managed to escape from Ravensbrück remarkably in April 1945. Mary Lindell, a fellow prisoner and nurse, ensured that Yvonne was on a Swedish Red Cross convoy as she was suffering from tuberculosis and she needed urgent medical attention. The story of these White Cross vans is absolutely phenomenal. They were given access to Ravensbrück and there was a list of prisoners who would be released. However, I'm really sorry to say they were kept at the gates of the concentration camp for some time while a mass killing spree ensued and the gas chambers were in use 24 hours a day. But Yvonne made it onto that bus. In fact, she was the last one on. Mary should have followed her, but Fritz Zuren, the commandant of Ravensbrück, kept her behind. But she did survive the war. Yvonne told me that she woke up in the Natural History Museum in Malmö, Sweden, and she said she will never forget, or she never forgot, waking up under the skeleton of a dinosaur. Eventually, she was returned to England, where she spent 9 months in King Edward VII Sanatorium in Midhurst, recovering from her illness. Another lesser-known agent who was also imprisoned at Ravensbrück was an Englishwoman called Liliane Rolfe. She'd moved from her home in Buenos Aires to undertake war work, and after training, she landed by Lysander on the 6th of April 1944 near Orléans to act as a wireless operator and to secure links between them and SOE headquarters in London. During her time in France, Liliane managed to send 67 messages back to England. This enabled the local Maquis to receive substantial supplies of arms at a very difficult time by helping to coordinate parachute drops of arms, ammunition, money, and clothes for the resistance, which helped build the organization up to maximum strength and to carry out some important actions. A key to Liliane's success were her excellent wireless skills. Those in London who received her messages commented on her consistent accuracy despite the difficult conditions in which she had to operate. These conditions being that the area was swarming with Gestapo by June of 1944, and Liliane had to keep moving constantly to avoid discovery. Her ability to keep working throughout these difficulties earned her a citation for the Croix de Guerre in January of 1946. However, after the arrest of her superior officer, she courageously continued her work in the midst of increasing danger. Because of this danger, Liliane moved regularly to avoid detection, and she transmitted from various places, including the homes of various resistance members, and her wireless set was hidden in all kinds of places: a wine barrel, under a baby's mattress, even in the roof of a dog's kennel. Liliane continued to work until her own arrest on the 31st of July 1944, which came about through a cruel twist of fate. She was caught quite accidentally when the Germans raiding her house were looking for someone completely different. She was found asleep on her bed, so exhausted that her wireless transmitter was out of its suitcase and lying next to her. She hadn't had a chance to hide it. They were not expecting to find a wireless operator, and they were certainly not expecting to find the wireless. She was taken to Frayne prison on the outskirts of Paris and then transported along with Denise Bloch and with Denise Bloch and Violette Szabo to Ravensbrück. There, the three of them were executed in the early winter of 1945. Not all wireless transmitters were successful in the field, and Odette Weiland's mission was cancelled before it even started. Now, Odette Weiland was a war widow when she started her work for F Section in April 1943, and she started out actually as a conducting officer to 4 Fanny students. She undertook wireless training in addition to her own duties and in her own time. In February 1944, she volunteered herself to become an agent in the field and underwent the relevant training. It's thought to avenge the premature death of her husband. But her French was surprisingly poor, and although she had a sound knowledge of the language, she spoke it with an English accent and had a tendency to mix up her vocabulary and her genders. Her lack of language skills was made up for by her intelligence and her patriotism, although she was reputedly terrified at the prospect of going back into France. Perhaps rightly so, as the odds did seem stacked against her, when she received only approximately half of the training she should have, as she was so urgently needed in France. She landed in the Auvergne in the southwest of France, where she soon told Pearl Witherington, with whom she had done some of her training, that she did not know her codes. Pearl was furious, and she went to the circuit leader, Maurice Southgate, saying, "You can't keep her, it's too dangerous." On the first night, they put her to a test, and she proved herself to be, quote, useless as a wireless operator. Southgate sent a report to F Section saying it was impossible to keep Ms. Weiland in their circuit. Her inexperience and lack of training meant she was unsuitable as a wireless operator, and they had neither the time nor the resources to invest in her. London decided it would be better that she worked as a courier to the labourer circuit near Le Chartres, south of Bourges. It's probable that this transfer to labourer was Odette's own suggestion, since she was in love with their circuit leader, Marcel Lecquier. They'd met at SOE finishing school and were engaged within days. But tragedy was to strike when Lecquier and his two colleagues were betrayed by a Nazi sympathiser. They were arrested by the Gestapo and Lecquier was tortured, eventually murdered at Buchenwald concentration camp in September 1944. But Lecquier's sister Mimi was able to prevent Odette Weiland from being arrested. She ran to her safe house and led her to safety just moments before the Gestapo arrived. Odette Weiland then contacted Virginia Hall for help, but she had no use for her in her circuit, and so Odette began the long journey home on foot. She crossed the Pyrenees with the help of escape line guide Santiago Strugo Garay, I've never pronounced his name right, on whom she made quite the impression. Arriving back in England via Gibraltar, Odette found she was no longer needed by F section, although Buckmaster said she had at times proved extremely reliable and hardworking. He released her to work for the Fanny, where she ended the war working in Belgium. She made such an impression on Santiago Garay that after the war, he went to England to find her. The two married and remained married until their deaths. One more, and I must do this one because I know that Ashley loves this story, as do I, and I will finish on Yvonne Corme, also known as Annette. She was arguably the most successful wireless operator in terms of messages sent. She was parachuted into Hamlet Saint-Antoine, 125 kilometres from Bordeaux, on the 22nd of August 1943, to work as wireless operator for George Starr, also known as Hilaire, and the wheelwright circuit. She was described as a perfectly unobtrusive and secure craftswoman, a first-class operator, a quite remarkable woman. Yvonne Corme transmitted 400 messages over the next 12 months, without a single miscode. With her help, wheelwright developed into one of the most active and important circuits in France, and for most of that time, she provided the only wireless link with London. She trained a locally recruited operator to help her. She never had a day's leave or rest. She lived with a Marquis and helped her organizer in the reception and planning of various operations. Her consistent efforts enabled the most spectacular development of a very fine and active organizations. The wheelwright network received approximately 140 arms drops, and Yvonne was present at several of these. She also assisted in the cutting of the power lines and telephone lines, resulting in the isolation of the Wehrmacht Group G garrison near Toulouse. And she was very, very security conscious. She was very conscious about the way she looked. She said, you mustn't do too much, not too much dyeing of your hair, not too much makeup. Try and dress and do as they do locally as much as possible. In fact, there's an anecdotal story that a lot of the women in the village where she lived wore gold hooped earrings. She didn't have any, so she made it a point to go out and get some of these earrings so that she didn't stick out. Now, one of the most important rules as a wireless operator was to keep moving. And she didn't. She actually broke one of the strictest rules. She stayed in a farmhouse. Now, in this farmhouse, she could see for 3 miles from the window. There was no running water at this particular farmhouse. And what I find remarkable is that although the Germans knew there was an English wireless operator in their area, more so they suspected it was a woman because of the fist that she used for Morse code. They never thought of looking at her or for her at this farmhouse because there was no electricity and there was no running water. And they did not believe that an English person could survive without their basic amenities. She was always under the threat of arrest. They all were. There was always a Gestapo presence. And so Yvonne always made sure she had a lookout. And on one occasion, she had a near miss. Her lookout had told her that the Gestapo were moving in on her from the east and the west. So they took a car and went due south, but they were stopped at a roadblock where they were questioned at gunpoint. And she was asked what was in the suitcase, which was on the back seat of the car. I opened it, she said, and knelt on the seat and showed it to him. He asked me what it was, and I said radio, which in German means X-ray set as well as radio set. In view of the fact that I was meant to be a district nurse, he thought it was actually an X-ray set. He said, "Get out." The engine of our car was already running, so we got out very fast. What a self-effacing account of the most terrifying event, where she was caught with her wireless set and still managed to get away. In a citation, it says Yvonne Corme distinguished herself repeatedly by keeping to her scheduled times of transmission with home station, even as battle raged around her, one so closely that a bullet tore through her skirt. And you can actually see the bloodstain on this dress, which is housed at the Imperial War Museum North, which is in Trafford Park outside Manchester. These SOE circuits, these wireless operators, and many other groupings that SOE helped to arm, undertook considerable part in the sabotage of German road, rail, and communications links during and running up to D-Day, the Allied landings in Normandy. At dawn on the 6th of June 1944, as I'm sure you are aware, 160,000 Allied troops landed along the heavily fortified and staunchly defended 80-kilometre stretch of the Normandy coastline. There were some 5,000 ships, 13,000 other vessels, and after 1,739 days of war, the liberation was finally underway. And I do sometimes think the work of the resistance is underestimated, because while the troops were arriving into Normandy, the resistance were there and they were fighting back. They were cutting communications lines. 32 telecommunications sites were destroyed. They blocked roads. They blew up some 960 railways across France, meaning that the Germans who were ordered to make their way towards Normandy couldn't get there. And these attacks were crucial. With the trains out of action and the roads blocked, the Germans couldn't get there, and the resistance helped cripple any potential for a significant counter-attack. Of course, it was extremely hard and arduous work, but it was recognized from the top, from General Eisenhower himself, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He said that SOE's work in Europe played a very considerable part in our complete and final victory. He estimated that the work of the resistance shortened the war by some 6 weeks. Now, I've mentioned today wireless operators. There were 12 female wireless operators working for F section. The rest of them worked as couriers, and in some events like Pearl Witherington and Nancy Wake, they even became circuit leaders. In my book, Mission France, I've ensured that the stories of all 39 female F section agents have been told, and that they've all been given the recognition they deserve. I've charted the work of the agents and investigated their roles, contributions, foibles, successes, and failures. It's clear these women didn't work alone, that they had a network of people behind them, that the role of male agents was just as important and dangerous as theirs, and also that the female agents worked incredibly efficiently given the dangers that they faced. Not only the obvious ones in wartime, but also the threats of exhaustion, illness, and for one of them, even childbirth. The sacrifice and bravery of those who were captured, facing imprisonment, interrogation, and the concentration camps is exemplary, and it's inspiring. There were 3 women who survived the camps. They suffered greatly, both mentally and physically, both during and after their incarcerations. But all of those who came back had undertaken immensely dangerous missions in enemy-occupied territory. Between them, they cycled thousands of kilometres, sent hundreds of wireless messages, faced identity checks, dealt with the daily fear of the Gestapo and collaborators, and endured privations that it is almost impossible for us today to imagine. They worked tirelessly, and they risked everything for the cause in which they wholeheartedly believed. The contribution of these women to the work of F section played a pivotal role in the Allied invasion, in the liberation of France from Nazi occupation, and in bringing an end to the Second World War by helping to secure an Allied victory. Thank you very much for listening.
My goodness, I've got goosebumps. Thank you so much, Kate. That was absolutely wonderful. I think